Hello, and welcome to my new continuing education series, Deconstructing Lewiston-Auburn and Maine History. My name is Phil Netto, and I will be your host for this new free education program. The purpose of this program is to provide those interested in Lewiston-Auburn and Maine history an in-depth look into some of the more notable and important events and people that in some way impacted our local community and our state. Before we begin, a little bit about myself. I was born in Lewiston, Maine, and was educated in the city's Catholic school system from the first grade through my graduation at St. Dominic's High School, which at the time was still in Lewiston. I served in the Air Force and was stationed at the Pentagon, where, to my good fortune, I had my first college experience by attending the University of Maryland in their Pentagon branch, located just a few floors below my fifth floor office. After being honorably discharged, my college record at Maryland opened the door for my acceptance to Bates College in Lewiston. I completed my sophomore year and the first semester of my junior year, but was unable to continue as I had exhausted my GI Bill funding and was unable to get financing, which halted my studies. But 19 years and 3 careers later, I completed my undergraduate studies in public administration at the University of Maine's Augusta campus in 1994. 11 years later, I completed my graduate studies in public policy and management at the University of Southern Maine. Between 1994 and 2017, I also had a wonderful final career as a public administrator. I would receive my first appointment in 1994 as Richmond, Maine's town manager, and after 5 years, would begin my next appointment as Lewiston's deputy city manager until my retirement in 2017. So while serving as Lewiston's deputy city manager, I had the opportunity to teach twice as an adjunct instructor for the University of Maine Augusta's LA College, and once for the Muskie Institute's Public Policy and Management graduate program at the University of Southern Maine. During my time at Lewiston City Hall, I also had the opportunity to be involved in one of the city's most historic events, the arrival of Somali immigrants who had come to this country as refugees, resettled in Georgia, and later relocated to Lewiston beginning in 2001. In the interest of trying to learn more about our Somali residents, I began to research and to write about the Somalis and the national and international attention they and our city were receiving. Some of my work was published and created a number of national and international media interview and national speaking opportunities for me. That experience also sparked my interest in researching our local and state history. And some of that work found its way into my first self-published book, The Unlikeliness of It All, Part 1. So this program will become yet another extension of my historical research. And in this first episode, you will learn about the Raytheon Corporation's arrival in Lewiston in 1959 and its sudden departure from our city in 1963. This historic event was selected because it remains one of the nearly forgotten, very impactful, and least understood chapters in our state history. Raytheon was not a case of a company merely changing its mind about locating in Lewiston and leaving after only 20 months in operation. Much of what influenced Raytheon's decision to leave had taken place years before they actually first occupied the building in 1961, something that received at the time or since little to no news media reporting since their departure. So without further delay, please enjoy Deconstructing Lewiston-Auburn and Maine History, Episode 1. Why did Raytheon suddenly leave Lewiston? The complete story of Maine's first commercial entry into the space age. Part 1. I hope you enjoy. Lewiston and Auburn, Maine history was built through their textile and shoe manufacturing centers through much of the mid-1800s and into the 1940s. According to the city of Lewiston, the city's 1938 payroll was the largest of any Maine municipality for more than 50 years. During this period, their dominance was reflected in the area's position as the state's leading manufacturing center and one of the largest in New England. By the beginning of the 1950s, competition from abroad in the southern states began to reveal itself in the declining number of Lewiston textile mills and Auburn shoe manufacturing facilities. During this time, business leaders and elected officials in both cities began to recognize the challenge of competing against the national and global influences of cheaper, mostly non-union labor as opposed to the heavily unionized textile and shoe manufactories in Lewiston-Auburn, or LA, and New England. Additional cost centers such as heating, fuel, electricity, and transportation associated with Maine's distance from national wholesalers and retailers were also driving many of the lost jobs in both sectors. And it was all happening at the same time in both cities. In Lewiston, newly elected Mayor Roland Marcotte was a visionary ahead of his time when he began to speak publicly as early as February 1952 about the need for diversifying the city's industrial business profile. He advocated for supporting existing businesses, but understood that the continued reliance to sustain the area economy with textile and shoe manufacturing was not in LA's best interest. In his March 1952 inauguration speech, he announced that he would set aside city funds for industrial development and diversification. That decision would create the City of Lewiston Industrial Development Department, also known as the IDD. Marcotte's vision for the IDD would mark the city's creation of its first economic development department, something that continues to exist to this day. The creation of the IDD would complement another effort that had begun earlier, and it would involve the Lewiston Chamber of Commerce, who assembled 18 community leaders in March of 1951. This group's sole purpose would be to find, quote, new enterprises to settle in the city, unquote. By the following year, that effort would become a formal organization when 5 Lewiston residents formed a nonprofit stock corporation, issued themselves $100,000 in common stock with no par value of the shares, and would name their new nonprofit entity the Lewiston Development Corporation, which also remains active to this day. Mayor Marcotte would embrace the LDC, but he believed that Lewiston city government also needed to work closely and seamlessly with the new Lewiston Development Corporation. The almost simultaneous creation of the LDC and the IDD would lead to several very important milestones that would validate Marcotte's vision to place more city focus on economic development. In Marcotte's second term in 1953, the new IDD would be instrumental in the expansion of Knapp Brothers shoe manufacturing that already had smaller operations in Lewiston and Auburn. Knapp Brothers would purchase and reuse the shuttered Federal Shoe Company, previously the Bait Shirt Company, a 4-story building in downtown Lewiston, bringing over 700 jobs to the city and to the LA economy. The Knapp expansion would also be happening while the Lewiston City Council attempted but failed to remove the budget funding for the IDD office. In the same year, the department helped to bring a consolidated Knapp Brothers to Lewiston. With the IDD now supported and funded by the Lewiston City Council, the IDD would enjoy more success with a November 20th, 1954 announcement about the New Jersey-based Geiger Brothers Publishing Company's decision to relocate in Lewiston. The IDD was instrumental in recruiting the new company, and the LDC would fill another critical funding need by raising $340,000 to build a 57,000 square foot building that would employ 180 people and open in 1955. Geiger continues to operate in Lewiston today and has expanded its footprint on the site. The company has become an integral part of the community's fabric and has become a leader in supporting educational initiatives in the city public school system. The LDC-IDD's success in securing the Geiger Brother project would launch a series of additional successes that would include the creation of LA's first business park in Lewiston and the recruitment of Paragon Glass, another New Jersey business. But perhaps the area's earliest and most regionally impactful project was the IDD and the state's successful recruitment of the Massachusetts-based Raytheon Semiconductor Division, which would occupy a 140,000 square foot, $2.5 million building that would be leased and constructed by the LDC to meet Raytheon's very specific needs. The company would potentially generate an annual payroll of $8 million and employ as many as 2,000 people when fully operational. Speculation about the Raytheon project coming to Maine had begun as early as March 1959. That month, a Biddeford-Saco Journal article reported the denial of Raytheon officials having selected Lewiston for their new factory. But they did confirm that Lewiston and other sites were under consideration. At the time, Raytheon had factories in Ontario, New Hampshire, California, and several other states. There was good reason for the buzz around Raytheon's possible interest in Maine. The state had not successfully recruited a company of Raytheon's stature and size since 1953, and had also experienced major mill closures in Sanford, Saco, and Lewiston. Also, it should not be forgotten that the country was still trying to process what it meant to be in a space race that had begun with the Soviet Union's surprise October 5th, 1957 announcement regarding their historic launch of the first man-made satellite into space. The 23-inch, 185-pound device and its beeping radio broadcast was circling the globe hundreds of miles above the Earth in space. The device would also mark the beginning of the space race between the USSR and the United States. On October 6th, the Russian satellite had a name, and it was Sputnik. The correct pronunciation was actually Sputnik, a Russian word for Earth satellite. The world reaction to Sputnik was almost immediate. People were naming ice cream sundaes named Sputnik. With Christmas approaching, one toy retailer was planning for Santa to appear on top of a satellite instead of his sleigh. Other retailers were creating holiday departments that featured only items that looked into space or were from outer space. And a panic in Tasmania occurred when someone launched a toy rocket that exploded in the skies above a Tasmanian city, making its residents believe that Sputnik had crashed nearby. But the world reaction to Sputnik would not hamper the US, who would quickly respond with its own launch of the Explorer satellite on February 1st, 1958. The moment was celebrated by then President Eisenhower, whose US Army he once led was responsible for a successful rocket launch that propelled the US satellite into space. The Explorer was not as large as the second Sputnik that had been launched earlier, but people believed that the US now possessed the, quote, scientific ability to keep up in the fantastic new race to dominate space, unquote. It was a race to space, as the word race had been used in several Portland Evening Express articles covering the launch. But the word dominate was also being used to describe Russian and US space efforts that were of more concern to US officials. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles suggested that an agreement be pursued between the USSR and US to limit space exploration and the use of missiles for peaceful activities. According to Dulles, failure to do so could result in long-term consequences that could be costly and dangerous for both countries in their efforts to control outer space. Concerns about what a space race could devolve into were global, and it was also the top news story of 1958. The concerns were not only about the prospects for nuclear annihilation. A majority of Maine teens surveyed by the Waterville Sentinel not only rejected the idea of going to space, they also believed that the Russians would dominate space, be the first on the moon, and use that dominance to rule the world. And while the US and Russians were busy competing for space dominance, the rumors about Raytheon's interest in Maine that had begun in March 1959 only grew. And so did the reports about Lewiston's selection, despite denials from Raytheon and Lewiston officials. In May 1959, the Portland Press-Herald reported that the site announcement would likely come within that week. The article also reported that the Boston national engineering firm of Arthur D. Little Company had previously recommended Portland, Maine to Raytheon officials. To the disappointment of many in Maine, no site announcement was made that week. But 2 weeks later, the Portland Press-Herald interviewed Lewiston IDD director Sam Michael, whose accomplishments, as they characterized it, as development director had attracted, quote, statewide attention, unquote. Although the interview involved no questions about the Raytheon project, there was mention of Raytheon in a closing statement at the end of the article. There was little doubt that this project was important to the state and to Portland, Maine. Fueling the excitement about the Raytheon project were reports that Sylvania was also looking to build in Maine, but decided to remove Waldoboro as a potential site. Sylvania said that their search would continue in Maine and New Hampshire, which already had a Raytheon plant, but Raytheon would not comment on the reports. Another article in the Portland Sunday Telegram speculated on recent reports involving two other major electronics firms looking to build in Maine. The newspaper reported that the sudden eagerness exhibited by companies to look at Maine was likely connected to an, quote, industrial contagion, unquote, phenomenon, a term used to describe events involving competing interests in the same manufacturing field who apparently contract the desire to quickly, quote, move into areas selected by others, unquote. Raytheon's decision to build in Maine filled the news cycle for months, but the rumors were finally put to rest when Raytheon officials made their public announcement about Lewiston's selection on July 1st, 1959. It would later be discovered that Raytheon's search process had actually been going on for 2 years, involved some 30 New England communities, and that only Biddeford-Saco, the greater Portland area, and the Twin Cities of Lewiston-Auburn were being considered in Maine. Once Raytheon had settled on the final areas of Portland and LA, a number of factors would be considered in making the selection that would include teams from the Arthur Little Group dispatched to Maine by Raytheon to assess wage averages, taxes, legislation, and the labor pool. That was followed by, quote, a new type of team to gain firsthand personal opinions about the livability of both Lewiston and Portland and particularly Lewiston-Auburn, unquote. The comment about the new type of team was likely a reference to the January 1959 follow-up meetings in Portland and Lewiston that involved Raytheon officials. It was also reported that Bangor and Auburn officials had also made last-ditch efforts to derail the Lewiston selection in April 1959. Bangor would drop out after a trip to Waltham, Mass., but Auburn persisted in its efforts into May 1959, quote, despite pleas from the state and Lewiston Chamber of Commerce not to muddy the waters, unquote. With the selection process finally over, everyone, including Auburn and Portland, viewed Raytheon's arrival as a seismic event for the city and the state of Maine. The company's arrival into the Lewiston-Auburn airport came complete with a police-escorted caravan from the airport into the city. A banner was hung on a caravan convertible filled with city and Raytheon officials that exclaimed, "Raytheon is here," and a room capacity press conference and banquet at Lewiston's DeWitt Hotel followed. Given the challenges associated with convincing manufacturers of their size to relocate in Maine, this was a significant achievement for the city's two economic development entities and the state of Maine's relatively new Department of Economic Development. In his announcement day luncheon speech at the DeWitt Hotel, Sam Michael reflected on the impact of Raytheon's choice in selecting Maine and Lewiston for their new facility. Quote, "The industrial heart of Maine has added to its industrial family the largest single industry under one roof in the state. The Maine industrial renaissance has begun," unquote. This project was also seen as a seminal moment for the city in terms of jobs and opportunities for women and families in need of second incomes. After a series of significant successes, the city was finally making visible headway with its plan to address their declining textile industries by adding the kind of diversity that could produce generational transformation to its local economy. Following the announcement, the Greater Portland Chamber of Commerce sent along a congratulatory note with their, quote, "sincere congratulations on the milestone in the industrial development of our great state," unquote. So did the Portland Press-Herald in their July 2nd editorial, who observed that LA would benefit from the selection, that the, quote, "indirect benefits would be soon felt from Kittery to Fort Kent," unquote. But Portland's disappointment was also publicly expressed, and understandable. Chamber officials had met with the Arthur Little Company, that special Raytheon team, a year before the Raytheon announcement. The Arthur Little representatives never disclosed what company was involved, but they did share that this manufacturing facility would employ 2,000 people. Thousands of chamber and city dollars and staff hours were spent on studies that would assist the company to consider Portland as their preferred site. Soon after the Arthur Little meeting, things became even more interesting when Raytheon representatives, the special type of team later identified by the Portland Press-Herald, then met with Portland officials along with Portland newspaper reporters. The company's representatives proceeded to tell the Portland group how much they liked the city, but they also disclosed that the company was also considering another Maine community. In the end, the variable later identified by Raytheon as the final determinant influencing their Lewiston decision was the average hourly wage differences between the two cities. Portland had the available workers, but could not compete with the differences in wages. Although disappointed, Portland officials believed that they would benefit, quote, "from the new Raytheon plant in time," unquote. They did not know it at the time, but their words would turn out to be very prophetic. Even before the excavation for the Lewiston project would begin, some city elected officials were incensed about a pay raise requested by Sam Michael days after the Raytheon announcement. Michael had received a pay raise of $2,500, raising his salary to $9,500 in March 1959, but it was less than he requested. He was now looking to receive the full amount that would raise his salary to $12,500. One city official argued that Michael would now be paid more than the governor of the state. Another official stated that securing a new industry for the city was not something that deserved a pay hike because Michael was simply doing his job. Michael responded to the criticism by stating that he would not seek additional pay hikes and confirmed that he would remain with the city for at least another year. This was in response to the fact that he did not have a contract and that he confirmed receiving both in and out-of-state offers for employment. Michael Ray's did receive support from a surprising source. The Portland Press Herald editorial board congratulated the IDD director for the successes over his tenure, in addition to his work on the Raytheon facility. They recognized the precarious position of an industrial promoter and the expectations connected to results. But they also hoped that Lewiston would see his value when there were no new factories to celebrate. These sentiments were similarly expressed by Lewiston Alderman Henry Bernier Jr. when he shared that some officials should take note that Michaels had, quote, done something out of this world for the city, unquote, and suggested that losing him was a real possibility as Bernier had personal knowledge of Michael being offered other positions recently. The furor about Michael eventually subsided, and the Raytheon Semiconductor Division would open, quote, the most modern semiconductor plant in the country, unquote. Operations slowly began in March 1961, would employ 800 people, and become a, quote, round-the-clock manufacturing facility, unquote, before its formal opening on June 21st, 1961. This historic open house event would also be celebrated by the Lewiston Daily Sun and Evening Journal's special 17-page Raytheon souvenir edition, dated June 21st, 1961, the day of the facility's opening. The edition was filled with congratulatory notes from businessmen and others around the state. It would also feature information about the history of the transistor, the company, and how Raytheon's transistor technology would be used in the space race, computers, and everyday life. The souvenir edition also featured a full-page ad that prominently displayed a Polaris missile. There were also several references in their edition mentioning their involvement in space, missiles, and rockets. There was no question how Raytheon saw themselves in regard to U.S. progress in space and how it viewed its place as a preeminent electronics manufacturer in the space race. The question is, after all this fanfare, all of the public hype about the new plant's role in the space race and new technology, and lastly, the statewide excitement generated by Raytheon's arrival being a transformational moment for Maine's economic development future. The question is, after only 20 months in operation, why did Raytheon announce on March 1st, 1963, that they would shut down their Lewiston facility and then move their operations to Mountain View, California? Well, to fully understand why this decision was made, more must be understood than simply following what was said publicly about Raytheon's departure in 1963. One must go back and understand Raytheon's history as a company, how it developed an interest in building electronic components, what the status of the transistor and semiconductor industry looked like in the 1950s and early 1960s. And finally, what decisions were made by Raytheon about their involvement in the transistor and semiconductor business years before the 1963 closure. So let's first look back at how the company came into existence and the path they took to enter the transistor industry.